Hello and happy Halloween. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to Spooky History. In this week's episode, we're actually doing a live episode as part of the Edinburgh Horror Festival 2021. Welcome to Spooky History. Okay, completely forgot that I had left my picture in the bottom corner whilst that played, so I was just sitting there looking silly. And hopefully you can actually hear me okay. Yep, this is the best time of the year as we head towards Halloween. On Sunday, we're going to have a special Halloween episode of Spooky History where we look at the history of Halloween. And if we have time tonight, I'm going to read a short excerpt from that to kind of get you into the mood. In this episode, this special live performance one, I'm going to be talking about a few things that have had a bit of an impact on me and my interest in the world of spooky history, where I'm from, the investigations I may have been involved in at various points in history, some of the places I've visited, and the history behind those places. So I think I want to go right back to the very, very beginning of where I first got interested to kind of set the scene for you for my interest in the world of spooky history. I was about 11 years old, young lad, child, and my grandfather, there's a picture of him there, there's a picture of my granddad, and there he is, you can see him, he's with a man in a suit. Oh no, sorry, wrong way around. The man in the suit's my granddad, and the one he's with is Remy, who was adorable, and if you blew air in her face, she would try to bite the air. It was amazing. But my granddad is the person who really got me interested in the world of the spooky. He used to go to a spiritualist church, and this spiritualist church was in Leicester, where I'm originally from, and it was part of the Adult Education Centre. And I went there one time. And we went to a seance. I didn't know what to expect. I was just a little kid at the time. I had no idea what to expect. And this medium comes in and she starts talking to the dead and she contacts apparently my grandfather's late mother. And then we did this. This may not be an actual photograph. This is table tipping, where we all kind of stood around and placed our fingers on a table and it started to bounce back and forward. A really prominent part of the spiritualist world in the 19th century, and you don't see it that often anymore. You see it maybe on a few paranormal investigations, but you don't really see it as part of your big, huge seances as much as you used to. And it's a bit of a shame because it's really good. And as a magician, I do this all the time. So, that's what started my interest in the world of the supernatural and the world of the spooky, and what started a lifelong interest in spooky history. And one of the books that my granddad used to own was this. This is Mysteries of the Unexplained, and it's from Reader's Digest. It's got some really kind of messed up stuff in here. Spontaneous human combustion, that type of thing. And if you've seen these types of books before, you know how wonderful they are and how much they can really spark your imagination and your interest in the world of the supernatural. And that, combined with my grandfather taking me to that spiritualist church when I was a little lad, yeah, that got me hooked. That got me interested in the world of the supernatural. And that is why I kind of do this now. Things like spooky history, things like my supernatural magic shows. It's why I do that. And tonight's episode is part of the Edinburgh Horror Festival, which goes out every year around Halloween. Tomorrow night, all the in-person shows begin, so we've been having a lot of digital live or pre-recorded stuff going out this week, and there's been some really good stuff on there. I hope I'm adding to that. If you enjoy what you're seeing here tonight, if you enjoy the stories I'm going to tell you, some of the adventures I'm going to be taking you on around places like Edinburgh, and looking at the world's most convincing ghost photograph. A lot of the stuff we're going to be discussing in this episode has not been featured in regular episodes of Spooky History and probably won't ever get featured in their own episode. So you're going to get to hear some stuff you wouldn't ordinarily hear, like the story about me and my granddad. You'll also be very aware that unlike most Spooky History episodes, this one's unscripted. If you enjoy what you see, please donate at paypal.me/noisyghost. So after my granddad got me hooked on all this, on this supernatural, paranormal, got me into this world, it's something that never left. It's something that always remained with me. And I didn't really start pursuing supernatural entertainments as a career until I moved to Edinburgh. I moved to Edinburgh when I was 23, so that was years ago. Yes, we won't say exactly how many, but it was quite a while back. And when I moved to Edinburgh, I did what a lot of resting actors do when they move to Edinburgh, and that is go and work for the ghost tours. And I worked for one set of ghost tours that went into the underground vaults. Now, the underground vaults of Edinburgh have a reputation for being among the most paranormally active locations in the world. We do have a full spooky history episode on the underground vaults coming up later in the year, but I want to introduce you, those of you who may not be familiar with them, to what the vaults are. Edinburgh spent most of its life as a small place, about a mile by a quarter mile wide. When it finally started to expand, they needed to build roads, and one of the roads they built was the South Bridge. Now, the South Bridge had 19 archways underneath it supporting it. To this day, only one of those archways can be seen to the naked eye. The other 18 archways are sealed up. They are hidden. They became underground. In these archways, they built streets, and they built rooms, and they built what you can see here, just up to the side there. You can see these are pictures of the underground vaults. There are 120 of these vaults there. The bottom one there is a traditional vault. The top two are corridors. And these are part of the South Bridge vaults, the underground city of Edinburgh. Now, when they were originally built to be used as storage by merchants and traders. The problem is they weren't waterproof. So the merchants and traders, they moved out, and the homeless moved in. But it was too bad even for them. They didn't like it very much either, so they also moved out. Now, there is some stories that Burke and Hare, the famous murderers, not body snatchers, actually got some of their victims from the South Bridge vaults, but there's not really any evidence that actually occurred. But the vaults closed up in the early 1800s, and they remained closed for quite some time. There is some debate again as to whether they were used as bomb shelters. Some parts of the underground were used as bomb shelters, whether these particular ones were, we don't quite know. But in the 1970s, they were reopened, and they were reopened to be used as something terrifying. Nightclubs and band practice rooms. Pretty soon, though, a lot of people started to get uncomfortable and unnerved in these underground vaults. They would see things wandering around in there. They would see entities out of the corner of their eye. One of the most famous ones to wander around the South Bridge vaults is the Watcher. The Watcher is a dark, shadowy figure that many people see just out of the corner of their eye, just making his way around as if he is guarding the underground vaults. Now, the underground vaults eventually became popular among people investigating the paranormal, and these sections here are used by ghost tours and people going into the underground city to explore the paranormal goings on. Now, at the bottom here, that picture there, you can see a stone circle. This is one of the most famous sections of the underground vaults. Back in the 1990s, there was a gentleman by the name of George Cameron who was in charge of a Wiccan coven. Now, it's not usual or customary really to have a coven underground. They tend to be open air situations. But George decided he was going to have his coven underground. Perfect for Edinburgh's history, considering how closely connected to the world of paganism it is. George created this beautiful, you can see there, stone circle. This stone circle was said to be a fortunate, lucky, protective place. One night, George was attempting to cleanse the room before it could be opened up and used for proper pagan practices. When he was doing so, he did something called scrying, which is a sort of, sometimes it's a kind of fortune telling involving mirrors, using mirrors for fortune telling or for communications. And it's said that in the process of doing this, he conjured up a less than pleasant entity. George, doing the only thing he felt he could do, was he cast a few of his charms and spells, and he encased the entity within the stone circle. To this day, people dare not go inside that stone circle. If they do, then they have been known to leave with cuts and scars. Oops-a-daisy, just gone too far forward. Cuts and scars. The picture on the top right was one I took when I was still working there, and that is a gentleman who came into the office after the tours and said, I stepped into the circle. I know I shouldn't have. Yeah. And he left with these cuts afterwards, fresh from having stepped inside the circle. You may remember Most Haunted Live also had a very similar occurrence. Now, maybe the skeptically minded of you might suggest that people may do this for attention or may injure themselves in some other way, but even if that is the case, it's still a really unsettling place and an unsettling area. George very quickly moved his coven location out of that vault and moved it several vaults over to a less dangerous part of the underground section. Now, the underground vaults themselves are a huge warren, a huge area, and they are very, very unsettling. In 2001, Professor Richard Wiseman, along with several of his colleagues, decided to investigate what was claimed by many to be the most paranormally active location in the world. Professor Wiseman asked the people who worked within the vaults, and these were a separate section, not the ones I was in, but they're kind of run side by side to it. He asked them to select the 10 most haunted locations in there, the 10 most haunted vaults, rank them from 10 to 1, but not tell him which ones because it otherwise would mess up the study. He then set about obtaining just over 200 volunteers. The job of these volunteers was to go into these vaults, random volunteer, random vault selected, placed in the vault for around about a minute, and then report back on any of the occurrences that they experienced whilst they were in the vaults. Well, there's some interesting results that came out of that. A lot of people to this day look at Richard Wiseman's research and they think that this proved paranormal occurrences, or what was happening in there. Well, a large number of people who took part in this study experienced something in these vaults. This could have been sensations of any type. It could have been a touch, a feeling. It could have been just a general sense of dread. It could have been full-fledged apparitions, and there were some people who reported that. What was more interesting, though, was how these reports broke down afterwards. When people who took part in this study were asked whether they thought these occurrences were paranormal in nature, the overwhelming majority of them said no. They didn't believe they were. They thought that even if they didn't know the answer, there was a possible naturalistic explanation for them. When the research was published, it actually went into a lot more detail of what could be going on in these vaults. You see, the vault that was claimed to be the most haunted was the vault that got the most number of reports. So what was happening in here? Well, Wiseman in his research suggested several possible explanations. For a start off, people who believed in the paranormal were generally more likely to experience something or attribute it to the paranormal when they were in these vaults. So there was already an element of bias there. Not only that, but there were several environmental factors that could have played into it. Due to the layout of the vaults, the brightness of the vaults, the size of the vaults, the shape of the vaults, and all variety of different factors of the vaults, it was believed that some sort of sensory issues were actually at play, possibly something like sensory deprivation, where you were going into a vault and suddenly your senses became a lot more attuned and a lot more alert as you had your eyes essentially sealed up. So this study in 2001 essentially came along and said we have got a number of naturalistic explanations for what is going on in the vaults. And I think it's really important that when these types of researches happen, when they're published and reported, a lot of the time they don't say, yeah, we think some people were making it up, because I don't hide the fact that I'm quite skeptical in these shows. But even I don't think the majority of people make things up. I think something is happening, and I am super interested to find out what that is. Incidentally, not interestingly, maybe interestingly, but incidentally, if you have any questions, do just leave them in the comment section of wherever you are watching us, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or on my personal Twitch stream. Hello. So, they're the underground vaults, and they are genuinely spooky, genuinely unsettling. Aside from this study that happened in 2001, aside from The Watcher, there are lots of other tales associated with the vaults. There are several stories involving young children. The vaults themselves run into a pub called the Banshee Labyrinth, which is strictly over 18s. On several occasions, members of the public have alerted the staff, genuinely concerned because they have seen a child running around the back parts of the bar, formerly part of the underground vaults. Several days ago, a member of staff reported that when they were in, they noticed that a child's handprint had appeared on the condensation of the glass on the inside of the window. This was quite a skeptical individual as well. So there are lots of these stories. If you get a chance to visit Edinburgh, you can go to places like the Banshee Labyrinth, get yourself a drink, and hang out in these types of places. In fact, the Banshee Labyrinth itself, if you go into their pool room, where their pool table is, not a swimming pool, it's directly beneath this stone circle, which explains why I never do well at pool when I'm in there, I guess. So, that's the underground vaults of Edinburgh, and although we are going to talk about them a little bit in future history episodes of Spooky History, I wanted to discuss them here because it's the Edinburgh Horror Festival, and they're an interesting topic that I could rattle on for hours. Now, you may not recognise this image. This is from a publication called News in Scotland, or News from Scotland. And it was published around the turn of the 16th century, 16th, 17th century, yeah. Around the reign of King James I of England, the 6th of Scotland. Can't you tell I'm used to having an auto cue? So, King James was an interesting fellow. He wasn't a particularly dynamic individual, by all reports. He wasn't a particularly compelling individual. He was quite weak in stature. He, I guess, had small man syndrome, because he caused a lot of problems for society at large. Up until the late part of the 1500s, the 16th century, when James comes to power in Scotland. A few years later, he comes to power in England. Before that, the number of trials and accusations of witchcraft in Scotland is very, very small. There is a book you can get on Amazon, and if you are in Edinburgh, you can read it at the National Library, which catalogues all of the trials and accusations of witchcraft in Scotland throughout history. Before James comes along, you've got a couple of pages worth of trials. Once James comes along, however, something goes a little bit wrong, and we end up with a nice thick book filled with lots of trials for witchcraft. But what happened? What happened, James? What did you do? Who hurt you? Well, I'll tell you. King James was betrothed to Anne of Denmark. He popped over to pick up his new bride, and whilst he was there, he discovered that there was an interesting craze afoot. The craze of witchcraft and witch trials and persecutions. And James became very interested in this. He and his wife Anne decided to return back to Scotland. And when they did, you can see from this picture here, just in the top left, their ship was attacked by the waves. And it took them 6 weeks to eventually get back to Scotland. When James returned, he was a little bit flummoxed. He was a little bit confused. He thought, well, it's either a freak weather storm. It's either that, or it could be this witch thing that my wife has told me about. I wonder which one. James hears about something that happened near to Northberry. Well, it's said Northberry, but actually it happens all over East Lothian, which is just to the east of Edinburgh. What happens is a young woman by the name of Gilly Duncan, she is accused of essentially witchcraft by her employer. What she's really been doing is collecting some herbs and things to help treat sickness, nothing particularly out there. But her employer is a rich, powerful man who he wants something out of Gilly that Gilly is not willing to give him. So he does the only thing a jilted lover can do. He accuses her of witchcraft. And he doesn't just accuse her of witchcraft. I'm sorry, there's a reason I'm not mentioning his name. The reason I'm not mentioning his name is because I have not bothered to look it up again, because I don't think that this man's name deserves to be remembered by anyone. You want a name to remember? Gilly Duncan. So he sets about torturing her to get a confession of witchcraft from her. And he uses thumbscrews on her and various other items and is deeply abusive. And she eventually confesses, because of course you do. You genuinely do. To get the pain to stop. I mean, it doesn't matter that the outcome's the same either way. It doesn't matter that you might be damning your eternal soul in some people's eyes. It's about getting the pain to stop. And that's what she did. But she didn't just do that. She named several other people, including a teacher from Preston Pans, which was just down the road from where she was, in a place called Tranent, and several individuals who all congregated together in North Berwick. When they were in North Berwick, they would dance on Halloween night for the devil and occasionally kiss his buttocks, as you do. One of these individuals, an elderly lady by the name of Agnes Sampson, she wandered out to the cliffs near to where James would be sailing into. And she took a cat and she threw that cat into the ocean, conjuring up the storm you can see in the upper left. This entire picture here represents the North Berwick witch trials, what was allegedly happening there. On the far left, you can see the devil himself in a pulpit that he appeared in at the church in North Berwick. Well, this story of them throwing a cat into the sea and worshipping Satan in order to kill James and stop his wife and him coming back, well, we got back to James. And this is what kickstarts Britain's obsession with witchcraft. The North Berwick witches set into motion a century at least of persecution, of abuse. And a lot of people die. Several hundred people die, several thousand, exact numbers I don't have, I can't find the exact specifics, because obviously this data can get obscured. But around about 300 people are said to have been executed for witchcraft in Scotland. Around 4,000 accused. Now, here's the thing. If you were accused of witchcraft, if you confess in Scotland, you're going to get executed anyway. And if you are tortured until you confess, you're going to be executed anyway. And if you have a trial and are proven guilty, you're going to be executed anyway. 300 people murdered. They weren't demonic entities. They were the victims of a literal witch hunt. When James took the throne in England, he expanded his obsession with witchcraft. Up until this point, under Tudor law, if you were practicing witchcraft but weren't causing any harm to anyone, you were kind of allowed to go about your business. But James changed all that. He made the act of witchcraft in and of itself an offence punishable by death. And it spread across Britain. This is all because one man couldn't take no for an answer and decided to torture his servant. And because James decided to blame weather on an old woman throwing a cat in the sea. So the witch trials lasted about a century. When we get to the 1700s, things start to calm down a little bit. 1735, you are legally allowed to act as a witch if you want to. You just can't pretend to be a witch and commit fraud. The 1735 Witchcraft Act essentially says you can be a witch, you just can't pretend to be a witch in order to commit fraud. There's a bit of a common misconception there. So Scotland was one of the worst places to be accused of witchcraft because you could be interrogated by the king himself. James wrote a book called Demonology, which we discussed in another episode, which essentially taught you how to discover if someone was a witch. And it's a terrible book with some pretty terrible arguments, but he was the king, and what he said went. Eventually, we did see the error of our ways here in Scotland, and we decided to pay tribute to the people who suffered in Scotland as a result of these persecutions. In Edinburgh, there is the memorial to the witches, people accused of witchcraft. I'm going to show you it now. It's that. It's called the Witch's Fountain, or the Witch's Well, and you can see it's fairly small. It's quite tiny, and it's very, very difficult to find. It's up near Edinburgh Castle. As you're coming out of Edinburgh Castle, it's to your left, near someone's house, very easily missed. Personally, I think we need something more. Personally, I think we need something that really addresses what went wrong. We have got 20-foot high statues of Adam Smith on the Royal Mile, the economist guy, but not to the thousands of people we persecuted. Now, a lot of James's ideas spread out of Britain and over the seas. A lot of the ideas that he put into practice, that he helped design, found their way all over the New World, and of course ended up in Salem as well. Interesting difference between Salem and the UK. In the UK, in Britain, if you were asked if you're a witch and you confess, you're going to be executed anyway. But in Salem, if you confess to being a witch, you would be allowed to go because you have cleansed your soul. God will deal with you. But in Britain, you would be executed. We have this idea of witch burnings being the way in which we used to execute people. We didn't. There were not very many records at all that attest to witch burnings or burnings of people accused of witchcraft. There's a couple maybe, and some of them are questionable. Most of the time we would strangle people first and then burn the bodies. So they were burned, but mercifully after death, I guess. So that's witchcraft. It's witchcraft in Scotland and how that originated and how that developed. Now I want to talk about this. This is a little bit more lighthearted. This is a little bit more light. This is an investigation that I was involved in back in 2009. East coast of Scotland again. Actually in Northberry, or just outside of Northberry, where the witches allegedly operated from. You've got Tantalum Castle. Tantalum Castle is on the coast, and it is a fortress, or it was a fortress. And it's never really had much of a reputation for hauntings until in 2009, when this photograph appeared. In 2009, a photographer by the name of Chris Aitchison made this photograph public. Richard Wiseman, we mentioned him earlier on, remember? He was running an event called The Science of Ghosts, which involved an attempt to find the world's most convincing ghost photograph. And there were a lot of submissions. Some of the ones that made it onto the website itself were of varying degrees of interest. But this is the one that actually won. This is the one that got the most votes for being the most convincing ghost photograph. Now, you can see just up by the grate, there is a figure making their way along. Now, a lot of people looked at this, and they looked at this and saw someone from the 16th century. Someone from around the time of the Northberry witch trials. We're in Northberry, so a lot of people may have jumped to that conclusion. So this photograph was really interesting. Some points about it. First of all, there are no costume guides at Tantalum Castle. It is just a castle that is open to the public. There is one or two members of staff who aren't usually even in the castle. They're in the gift shop. Love a gift shop. This is in the, just as you go through the entrance to the castle, just before you get into the main courtyard, there is this section. This is about 4 stories up, 4 floors up. And this person is walking down steps. So this photograph became the world's most convincing photograph of a ghost. And the press went mad for it, and television and newspapers. And I was really interested. Richard was going to investigate this himself, along with Professor Caroline Watt, who heads up the Cursor Parapsychology Unit here in Edinburgh, that looks into psi phenomena. And Richard and Caroline were joined by Chris Aitchison, who took the photograph, and me on the far end there, with some wonderful hair going on. So myself, Richard, Chris and Caroline headed out to Northberry to have a look at what could actually be causing the haunting or the ghost figure to appear at Tantalum. Now, there were a couple of ideas of what could be causing it if it wasn't something ghostly. One of them was something called Pareidolia. Now, Pareidolia is, in its simplest form, it's when you look at clouds and see shapes. Essentially, we are pattern finders, and we're very, very good at recognizing patterns. So the idea that was first put forward, or one of the early ideas, was that the sun was hitting the brickwork at the right point, and the brickwork, combined with the grates and the railings and the distance that Chris was, all combined to create this illusion. I know right now you're sat there shaking your head. And we went up there and we had a look. Instantly we knew that wasn't what was causing it. There was not really anywhere for enough light to get in to create that type of brightness. There was not really anywhere to create that type of shape. There was not really anywhere to create anything really of that design. So the other option was a little less interesting. The other option was that it was someone walking down the steps. And you can look at it and you can kind of say, well, no, this looks a little bit haggard, like a spirit. It looks like they're wearing a ruff. This is someone who would have been caught walking quickly down a flight of stairs, turning, and we can't see them that clearly because they are partly in shadow because there's a lot of darkness up there, and the grates themselves are adding potentially to the illusion of highlighting elements of the face. So that was our kind of our hypothesis. So what we did was myself, Caroline and Chris stayed down on the bottom floor with a camera. I think it may have been the same camera Chris used to take the photograph. We got there at the same time of year, at the same time of day, with fortunately the same type of weather, and we started trying to recreate the angles with the camera as Richard was up top, just walking around trying to get the positioning right. And that's what we ended up with. That is what we ended up with there. On the right is Professor Wiseman. On the left is the entity, the ghost. Now, some of you might say, well, yes, his head's a little bit bigger than hers and he's a little bit clearer, but she could be a little bit further back. And if she's heading out to the right, where the door is, she could be turning. This is one of those 1 in a million shots, really. So I kind of think that's what it is. Me, personally, I think it was just a really lucky shot of someone walking down the steps. What do you think? Do you think it was actually something supernatural? Do you think it was actually a ghostly entity making their way down the stairs? You can go to Tantalum Castle. I'm not sure if it's open just yet to the public. Bits of it are, so maybe you can pop along to that at some point and see for yourself. Try and recreate Tantalum Castle. I'm having a little bit of issue with the YouTube stream, it would appear. There we go. No, it's righted itself. It's fine. It's all good. So, that is Tantalum Castle. That is the Tantalum Ghost. All right. More of my adventures in the supernatural. We've talked about what I did as a job and the Southbridge Vaults and the ghosts and the ghouls around that. We've talked about my accompanying Professor Richard Wiseman and Professor Watt out as they investigated the Tantalum Ghost. Now I want to talk about a little adventure I went on. And this is my favourite topic to talk about. You may be wondering why I've not done a spooky history episode on this topic yet. And that's because I'm just building up to it. Because I love this topic so much. The birth of spiritualism. Right back at the beginning, I talked about my grandfather, and I talked about how he took me out to a spiritualist church when I was 11 years old, and I saw table tipping. What I didn't say was I actually took part in the table tipping as well. That's amazing. But spiritualism began 173 years ago in a place called Hydesville in western New York. And the three women you can see here are the three founders: Leah, or Lee, Kate, and Maggie Fox. It's actually Kate and Maggie that are the most important and the most interesting, really. Lee is kind of involved. We'll get onto her in a minute. I have issues with Lee Fox. But Maggie and Kate, I adore. So in 1847, John Fox and his wife move into this little house in Hydesville. And there's the house, and it says on there north of Newark. That's where it is. It's part of a district called Arcadia now. And in 1847, in December, John and his family, his wife, Margaretta, and his two youngest daughters, Kate and Maggie, moved into this house. It was meant to be a temporary location while they had their main house being built. And they move in. A few months later, Maggie and Kate are trying to sleep when they hear... Let's just send the microphone into the red. Knock, 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 knock. In their bedroom at night. And this is really unsettling, very scary. They tell their mother, very unsettling, very scary. And they carry on, and they continue. Comes to a head March the 31st, 1848, when one of the daughters, one of the children, it's unclear whether it's Maggie or Kate, different reports put it as different people, says out loud to this knocking entity, whatever it is, "Do as I do." And they clap several times, and the entity claps back the same number of times. And this kickstarts spiritualism. This entity incident is what begins this entire movement of spiritualism. As soon as the girls have communicated with the spirits, their mother is disturbed, and she wants more proof, so she starts asking questions. How old are my daughters? And you get the correct knock, knock, knock. They get their neighbours in, and the neighbours come round. The neighbours start asking questions. Knock, 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 knock. They develop a communication method. We tend to think of one knock for yes, two knocks for no. That's not quite what it used to be. It used to be one knock for no, two knocks for maybe, unsure, three knocks for yes, and 5 knocks for fetch the alphabet board, where you could spell out longer words. Through this process, the young Fox sisters and what appeared to be their entire neighbourhood of Arcadia, descending on this one-bedroom house, discover that they are speaking with the spirit of a peddler by the name of Rosner, or Rosmer, who had been murdered by a former occupant called John C. Bell 5 years earlier and buried in the basement. The men of the town go down to the basement and they start digging and dig and dig and dig and dig and dig and dig. And they don't find anything, they just hit water. So they go away, and everyone comes back the next night and starts asking more questions to find out more answers. And again, these spirits start answering yes, 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 or no, 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 or giving the correct answers. And the men again go down and start digging into the pit. No water, nothing, just water. And the Fox sisters' home becomes known as a centre of attention for the paranormal. They discover that not only have the Fox sisters themselves heard these knocks, but former occupants of the house have as well. And one former occupant even claimed to have seen an entity, a man, dressed exactly how she remembered the peddler being dressed, standing and then disappearing in the kitchen. Now, no prosecution was brought against John C. Bell. No body was found, or at least no human body. There were some bones found in the well at a later date, but they've never been properly confirmed to be human. They weren't actually found in the cellar pit, they were found in the walls. But they may have been dog, we're not entirely sure. Anyway, this report gets out there, and Lee, who lives in Rochester, just a couple of towns over, and is a much older sister, comparatively anyway, she heads back to Hydesville to find out what's happening with her younger sisters, little kids at the time. Kate was about 11, Maggie was about 14 or 15, and Lee comes back and she wants to look after her sisters. So she takes her sisters away. She's the big older sister, Lee. She takes them to Rochester. Suddenly people start paying attention to them. Not only that, but Lee discovers she can also communicate with the spirits, with the knocks and the raps and the bumps. The spirits tell the three women that they have to make spiritualism bigger, more important. And so they hire out a place called Corinthian Hall in Rochester, which is a huge, huge hall. Famous abolitionists like Frederick Douglass spoke there. Big, important place. And Maggie and Lee take to the stage and they say, we are communicating with spirits. Knock, 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 bump, bump, bump. And the crowd goes absolutely wild in a furious, angry way, launching onto the stage, attacking children, essentially. And they demand that a committee of 5 learned individuals get together and test the girls. So they do, and they go away. And the working theory is that they're making the knocks themselves with their feet or ankle joints. But they go away and they test them. Come back the next night to Corinthian Hall. And these 5 learned, respected men say, yeah, we tested them. Couldn't find any explanation whatsoever for what was going on. Don't know what's happening. Don't know how it's occurring. The mob gets angry again and they demand once again that a team of 5 proper learned men test the girls. So again they do. They go away. And again the next night these 5 learned men come back and they say, not a clue. No idea. The mob goes wild again, throwing firecrackers onto the stage, shooting guns. We want 5 more men to investigate them again. So they go away again and they come back. Yeah, we tested them. We find no evidence of trickery. The crowd is now more curious than anything, and spiritualism begins. It spreads from Hydesville to Rochester. Maggie and Kate and Lee move to New York, where they're looked after by the editor of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, who is himself a champion of spiritualism, this new religious movement, this idea that you can talk to the dead. And all of a sudden, these young women are celebrities. They are famous. And people all around America suddenly find they too can communicate through knockings. Within a few years, these knockings have developed, and mediums are now bringing through full-blown spiritual entities. Lee herself starts to bring through ghost lights. Maggie and Kate are involved in table-turning sessions. Eventually, the pressure and the fame gets a bit too much for Maggie and Kate, and they start drinking quite heavily. They meet husbands, but are both widowed after just a very short period of time. In fact, it is such a short space of time with Maggie's marriage to a chap called Elisha Kent Kane that they may never have even had a wedding night. That's how quickly he had to go away for his work, which was Arctic Explorer, which is an awesome sounding name. But he, Kent Kane, died of an illness. He'd been ill for a long time. After just a couple of years, they hadn't really had much time together. Kate's husband was an Englishman. She'd moved to England for a while. He passes away. And they both return to working as spiritualists again. And they both return to drinking quite heavily. Things get a lot worse. And as spiritualism gets a lot bigger and more dominant, and you get people flying and levitating now, and appearing and disappearing, and Maggie starts to get really annoyed with the situation. And Kate gets really angry with her older sister Lee, who has become this matriarchal figure within the world of spiritualism. Kate's get really angry with her because she thinks that Lee has reported Kate because of her drinking to the authorities, and the authorities have taken Kate's kids off her. She does eventually get them back. But Kate's angry at Lee now. Maggie's angry at spiritualists now. And they decide in 1888 that the time has come to reveal what really happened in that house in Hydesville all those years ago. Maggie and Kate hold a press conference with a journalist, and then they hold a larger session on a stage, and they say, yeah, we were just clicking our toes. That's what we were doing. The people who thought that were right, they just never were able to prove it because we were just so good at it. They spent a while touring the circuit, exposing spiritualism. It became known as the death blow to spiritualism. Kate very quickly retracted her confession. and began practicing as a medium again. Within a year, Maggie did the same. Essentially, spiritualists didn't want to know them now. Skeptics didn't want to know them now. They were drinking, they were poor. They spend the last few years of their lives being looked after by some of the people who really supported them. Lee dies first in the late 1880s. It's 1891, actually. Just of old age. She lives a nice, happy life. She married several times. Her full name was Anne Lee Fox Fish Brown Underhill by the end of her life. She leaves a legacy. Kate dies next. She dies in 1892. Complications brought on due to her drinking. The following spring, Maggie slips into a coma, again brought on by her drinking, and never wakes up. The Fox sisters began a movement that spread across the entire world that is still with us to this day. Whether they were genuine or not, the impact they had on the world cannot be underestimated and cannot be dismissed. And so, I had an opportunity back in 2019, before the entire world went a little bit weird, to go over and visit Hydesville. This isn't actually Hydesville. This is the gravestone in Cypress Hill Cemetery in New York, which was erected a few years ago. This is the location where the house was. The house, you can see the inside picture there. The original one was moved in the early 1900s to a place called Lilydale, which was just down the road from Hydesville, and it was a medium centre, a town full of mediums, and it burned down in the 1950s. On the left, you can see some excavation work. That is the foundations of what is left of the Fox sisters' home in Hydesville. Around 15, 20 years ago, it was just overgrown. It was forgotten about until a important and wonderful woman by the name of Tracy, who was a spiritualist, is a spiritualist, got involved and was essentially, no. We need to do something with this place. So she did. And we now have the Hydesville Memorial Park. On the top right, that is a kind of a hut that covers over the ruins, the foundations. That's all that's left. You can see me actually in there. I'm actually stood, in the picture I'm stood inside. I am stood on the exact location where the peddler, Rosner, was said to have been buried, where they dug up and just hit water all those years ago. Just to my right, just near where the reef is, in the wall there, that's where they found the bones, which I say may have been an animal. So that's it. Just outside, there is a little stone marking Hydesville. There I am with Teresa Durer, who is the producer of Spooky History, and my wife. Decide which order those things go into. And also, for those of you who have heard the occasional cough, is the woman with tonsillitis sat just over there. So that was us when we visited Hydesville. And Hydesville is important. And I'm so glad with what Tracy's done with it. And I can't wait to go back there again one day. And I am honoured that I had a chance to go and visit it. So that's kind of my spooky history right there. That's my interests, the things I've been involved in, my research that I've been involved in, the places I've been to, and the spooky history that surrounds it. And I thought, as we head into Halloween, as we approach tomorrow, the 1-year anniversary of Spooky History's first episode going live on Spring Heel Jack, so we've got that. And then Sunday's Halloween, where we're going to be having the History of Halloween episode going out. All of this kind of coming together, I thought this was an appropriate topic for tonight's live stream. Gary there on YouTube, loving this. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for tuning in. Just have a quick look. Anything else? Excellent. Fibro Warrior over on Twitch is, if you would like to learn more about the Hydesville Memorial Park, check out their Facebook page here. So, you know... yeah, it's my wife. Although just above her is another comment. Want to become famous? Buy followers and viewers on bigfollows.com. Don't buy followers. And on Facebook as well, she's just shared the same thing. So that's bringing us almost to the end. But before we go, just a couple of things. First of all, if you've enjoyed this, please do donate. paypal.me/noisyghostent. It helps keep the show going. It helps keep me in coffee. And it helps keep Teresa in salted peanuts. So do donate if you can. But just before we do go, I want to read a little excerpt from the upcoming episode this Sunday on the history of Halloween. You can tune in on Sunday to get the full episode. But for now, I thought we just end with a little bit of setting the mood. Though Halloween has been part of British culture for centuries, until recently it was not the behemoth we know today. Britons often refer to Halloween as an American import, despite Britain's major influence on its origins. Origins you can find out more about if you tune in this Sunday for our Halloween episode, the history of Halloween. The truth is, Halloween wasn't much of an event in the American calendar either at the time. It was imported actually by Irish and Scots settlers in the 19th century, sort of coming full circle. They took all of those old traditions with them and introduced them more prominently into the American culture. They did, of course, make some changes. It was common in Britain to carve turnips on Halloween, reportedly to ward off evil spirits, but in America the pumpkin became prominent as a carving tool and became a symbol of Halloween, primarily because it is far, far easier to carve a pumpkin than a turnip. Pumpkins have been carved before the introduction of Halloween to the States, so it was an easy adoption, and the pumpkin would become even more prominent thanks to its inclusion in the tale of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, despite the story not mentioning Halloween. And actually, if you read it, it's not really a ghost story. 90% of it is about a dude who's in love with someone and they're not interested. And then the town jock may or may not chase them out of town dressed as a ghost, or it might be a ghost. That's spoiler alert. But the thing that really helped cement Halloween as an American tradition was the Great Depression of the 1930s and post-Second World War society. Thanks to the Celtic settlement, Halloween was recognised each year, but a lot of it related to feasting and festivities, something that would face a major struggle in the early to mid-20th century. Due to a lack of resources and funds, groups of children and families would go from house to house to engage in celebrations more cheaply, and with this evolving into asking for food. The earliest recorded incident of specifically trick-or-treating in connection with Halloween was actually in Canada, reported in a Canadian newspaper in 1927. It would take a couple of decades for trick-or-treating to properly take hold, but once it did, it became an integral part of Halloween tradition. Trick-or-treating also connects to an earlier tradition of pranking, again imported by the Celtic settlers, whereby groups of children would enact pranks on people of the town on Halloween, something that would combine with the door-to-door begging, guising and party tricks, and give us the final version of trick-or-treat. This is probably a good thing, as Halloween night pranks could often turn violent, with Halloween of 1933 being so bad it earned the title of Black Halloween. Trick-or-treat itself is such a large topic that it will need its own episode. Even the colours we associate with Halloween, mostly orange and purple, are a result of the Americanization, with pumpkins and darkness supplanting the earthier colours previously associated with the festival. As the children of this generation grew up, they were reluctant to let go of the spookier fun they had as kids, and so we saw a boom of horror movies, haunted events, parties and celebrations, but it was still very much an American thing. It was during the 1990s when Halloween in the commercialised American style began to take root around the world. There were various factors in this, Americans emigrating and taking their traditions with them, looking at my wife, much like how the original settlers took their version of Halloween abroad themselves. But we must look at the power of television and movies. With Halloween being such a prominent part of American culture, it was inevitable it would seep into films and television. It was this that allowed the spread of the American Halloween and the rise in popularity of American television and movies such as The Nightmare Before Christmas, which is a Halloween film, and many people began to embrace the more fun side of the festival. If you want to find out the full history about Halloween, the full story, then we are releasing our next regular episode of Spooky History on Sunday, which is Halloween, and it is the history of Halloween, where we look back at a lot of the history, a lot of which is actually Scottish and Irish. So you'll find out all about that. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. Thanks for watching Spooky History. I hope you learned something. If you didn't, I hope you were at least entertained. If you weren't, at least I hope you were distracted. If you did enjoy it, please do donate. Link just over there. Thanks for watching, and, well, do have nightmares. Goodbye.